Hello again, everybody. I recently finished my Intro to Programming series, and I also made a compilation of that series into one massive video, if you prefer that method instead. Being a self-taught programmer, I wanted to make a follow-up video giving more recommendations on how to learn the basics, and more importantly, where to go after the basics and beyond. Many people stop right after the basics, and it's really frustrating if you don't have any prior programming knowledge. I know the feeling of not knowing what to learn next or what to search to learn. So without further ramblings, let's get into my recommendations. So my first tip for learning the basics is to watch tutorials, like my Intro to Programming playlist. Secondly, I recommend to read books. They tend to be more comprehensive and catch things that online tutorials often leave out because they don't seem to fit well into a short video. Thirdly, I recommend searching Google and the internet, especially when you're working on a project, which we'll discuss more a little bit later. And lastly, I recommend coding and more coding. And this may seem really simple and really like a duh moment, but it's amazing how many people, including myself, got stuck in what is known as tutorial purgatory, which just means you constantly watch tutorials and you don't code enough and it doesn't actually sink in what all you're learning. Which brings me to the concept of active and passive learning. So passive learning would be like watching tutorials and reading books and just gathering knowledge about the subject. And then active learning would be the actual coding. And I guess watching tutorials, some tutorials are pretty interactive. They could be kind of lumped as in between active and passive. But basically what I'm getting at is you want a good balance of both active and passive learning. Now, everybody learns at their own pace and learns differently. Some are more visual than others, but I do recommend taking the suggestions I gave and figuring out a balance of all those methods that works the best for you. Now let's move on to after the basics. So after you feel like you got the basics at least semi-solidly down, you don't have to know them inside and out, but just pretty solid. I recommend making a project that interests you. Now that can be a lot easier said than done because you can pretty much make anything you can think up with code. And sometimes you don't really have any specific thing that you can think of. It's almost like there's too many options sometimes. But I would like to suggest a little bit more specific suggestion, and that is a project that has both a GUI, or GUI for short, and a DB, or database. And I suggest this GUI to be a desktop GUI. Alright, before I go into more detail about why I think this project is good for after the basics, I want to talk about why not to go into the major commercial uses for Python, at least not right after the basics. So the three main commercial uses for Python, or the three jobs that you'll get paid for in Python most likely, is 1, web development, 2, data analysis and machine learning, and 3, scripting/automation. So the web, I think we're all familiar with, is things like websites. Data analysis is like taking large data sets, could be like Amazon sales or whatever, and using Python to programmatically analyze that data and maybe even graph the data. And scripting and automation can be a pretty wide range of things, so I'm not going to get into too much specifics with that, but it is another big use case for Python. Now, it may be tempting to just jump into one of these three right from the basics, but I think that is too much for a beginner, especially who hasn't gotten the fundamentals yet. These areas require you to learn what is known as a framework, which is just code and other tools already written to solve common aspects of a field such as web programming, graphical user interfaces, and much more. It could also require you to learn another programming language, and sometimes even it might require you to learn both. For example, in web development, you'll probably have to learn a web framework, and you also have to learn JavaScript because Python doesn't run on the web. And as I said before, I think that's just a little much for somebody just starting out in coding. Alright, so now let's get into the reasons for my project suggestion. 1, it teaches core concepts of a user interface and storage. This is often known in coding as front end and back end. The front end is the UI or user interface, and the back end is the DB or database that stores the information that gets displayed on the user interface. And oftentimes you'll take data from the user interface and store it back into the database. So the UI should carry over to most other applications with the UI. For example, a website, the web page you see is the user interface, or if you're into mobile applications, the application will have a user interface. And the core concepts will be very similar. Likewise, dynamic websites almost all have a database. And so on top of the JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and framework, you would also have to learn a database. So this is one less thing to learn for that. So my second reason is you will only have to learn one programming language. Now you will have to learn what's called SQL, or Structured Query Language, for the database, but that's not actually a full-fledged programming language, and it's a lot easier to learn, and like I said before, you'll have to learn it anyway eventually. Also, because of one programming language, the syntax of the other programming languages you would have to learn won't get in the way of the core concepts and fundamentals you're trying to push home by doing this project. There is benefit in learning other languages, and I actually recommend it, but just not until you for sure get the fundamentals and the foundations down pat. So I want to go into more detail of the project specifics I recommend, although you could use anything you want to implement these core concepts of a user interface in a database. For the UI, I recommend using tkinter. This is a built-in Python module, so that's convenient that you don't have to install any third-party modules. And if you don't know what a module is, you can check out my Python video on modules. Then for the backend, or the database, I recommend using a database called SQLite to actually store the information. And then we'll also need another Python module, and this one also comes with Python. It's called SQLite 3. And that will allow us to use the Python programming language to interact with the database and run queries. So once again, this is considered the front end, and the database is the back end. And good news, I plan to do a series on both of these things, and also how to tie them together, which is really important. Now, I also want to talk about beyond the project, and this is where I recommend learning something called source control, and I specifically recommend learning Git and GitHub. So Git is what is known as a source control system, and GitHub is what is known as a code repository, or repo for short. So basically, Git helps you manage the changes you make to your source code or your code files over time, and is especially useful in a development team environment where multiple people are working on the same code base. And GitHub is a place to store that code in the cloud. There's other code repositories out there, such as Bitbucket and many others, and you could use those with Git or other source control systems, but the two most popular, I would argue, are Git and GitHub. And you could alternatively learn this before your project, but if that feels like too much, I would say just don't worry about it till after you're done with the project. Next, I would suggest deciding what field of programming you want to pursue. This is whether you want to go into web development, mobile applications, machine learning, etc. Then, if that field fits within one of Python's main purposes, then I would suggest learning a Python framework for that field. So for example, if you're into something like web development, you could learn the Django framework, or if you're into data analysis or machine learning, you could look into Matplotlib and Pandas, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, if it's not fitting in one of Python's main purposes, you probably just want to go ahead and learn another programming language that is best fit for that field. And don't feel like you've wasted your knowledge, because learning Python is valuable in many other areas, and good chance, even if it's not the main language you're using, you could use it in some other way. The most important thing is that it taught you the core concepts and fundamentals, and it makes learning the next language that much easier. Alright, so that does it for my suggested learning path. Stay tuned for the mentioned upcoming playlists. Depending on when you're watching this, they may be linked here at the end of the video already. So I hope this helped, and God bless.